Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, February 4th, 2026. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington Free Beacon editor Eliana Johnson. Hi, Eliana.
Hi, John.
Commentary senior editor Seth Mendel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And commentary social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Big day in media. The Washington Post, once one of the two dominating journalistic institutions in the United States, massive layoffs announced this morning at 8:30 a.m. So vast and so determined that everyone was told to stay home, and the fired people, as of this moment, as we are now podcasting at 9:30 in the morning, have been cut off from the computer system. They're all being informed who's been laid off. Apparently the sports department is closing, the books department is closing, the foreign desk is being shrunk, the Metro desk, I think, is being sort of like highlighted. And on the same day that word started emerging that this gigantic layoff was going to happen, the New York Times happened to mention that in its fourth quarter, it had gained 250,000 new digital subscribers to get its total subscriber number over 13 million. And to add to the story of the nature of legacy media institutions, all of which we are told are failing, the New York Post, which after 30 years became profitable, actually way more than 30 years, but became profitable in 2021, opened a new edition, or an entirely new newspaper in some ways, called the California Post, which is going to be printed on paper and distributed in California with 80 new staffers. So we have two institutions, that is News Corp, which publishes the New York Post, the California Post, and the Wall Street Journal, that are financially successful, and the New York Times, that are financially successful, have weathered the legacy media, new media, internet media storm. And we have the Washington Post, which was purchased for $250 million by the world's richest man, and which trumpeted itself as the new beacon of freedom in the Trump era with its slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness," has now spent the last 10 years committing suicide, journalistic editorial suicide, not Jeff Bezos's suicide, not his publisher's suicide. It is a product that people do not want to read, that they have withdrawn their subscriptions from, that they were promised falsely would somehow end the Trump era. And then when Jeff Bezos decided to reconcile himself to the fact that all of these machinations weren't working and that he was therefore going to step out of the business in the paper of endorsing candidates and being a voice for this resistance, then had a mass of subscription cancellations last year. This is what the people who want to say that it's Bezos's fault that the Post is failing are running to say that he destroyed it because he said, "I don't want to endorse candidates anymore." That this is lipstick on a pig. The Post failed because beginning in, first of all, it's been in decline for 20 years, but beginning in 2015, 2016, the Post became the wokest institution in the United States. And if you think that the two are not connected, you must work for Laurene Jobs, who has $40 billion and is willing to spend ungodly amounts of money to support, a journalistic institution like The Atlantic. And so you can sit at your perch at The Atlantic and announce that it's really terrible, everything that's happening in journalism and how sad it is, and all these wonderful professionals and all the work they do. And they've been producing garbage. And finally, the bill came due. That's my take.
Anybody I will say that Jeff Bezos did make one big mistake. He did not hire Barry Weiss when he had the chance.
Well, we'll see how bad. We'll see where the.
But there's a deeper point there, right?
Here.
Which is like you're selecting they restrict their own range of selection. Who's going to edit? Who's going to save the paper? This, that, and the other thing. And it's sometimes if you're CBS and you have a new owner who wants to take a chance, and you take a chance and you try something. Nobody can imagine the Washington Post taking a chance or letting its hair down in that sort of way. And in fact, what would happen would be a huge staff revolt. There is some rebellion at CBS, but they're just not letting them derail the new team. And the Washington Post, I think people understand that they are not capable of preventing a rebellion that takes the whole place apart, because the top editors would be part of that rebellion. And so there is a closed-mindedness that is the one unshakable foundation of what the Washington Post editorial position has been for the last at least decade, probably more. And that in itself is in the end, you're not going to find somebody to save it, because you're just moving identical pieces around the board.
I think looking at the Post in the first Trump era, its news coverage was, as you said, John, further left than the New York Times. It was, it adopted the slogan "Democracy dies in darkness," which will never be forgotten. And it had huge subscriber numbers. Then come 2024, Bezos realized he didn't have a serious news operation on his hand, because the place was completely and totally anti-Trump. And he turned on a dime and decided that he wanted to have both a credible newspaper with serious journalists in it who were not totally and utterly left-wing, lunatics. And he wanted a different kind of editorial page that was a champion of free markets. Unfortunately, they had built up a subscriber base that was addicted to the anti-Trump garbage that the paper had been putting out. And I think that has put the Post in a difficult position, but not impossible given Bezos's resources. But it's a generational project now to build up a new audience for the journalism the Post is putting out. And I think if you just think about it on a longer term trajectory, the project can make sense. Sure, today they're laying off these people, but over the next 10 years or 20 years, they can rebuild a foreign desk that is not filled with Al Jazeera expats who simp for Hamas. But they will have to find and grow new talents over the next several years.
There's another.
Sorry.
Can I add one other data point, which looks back a little further than just looks several decades before Trump? And that's that when I moved here more than 30 years ago, I instantly got a Washington Post subscription because I always subscribed to my local paper. I'd come from Atlanta, where I also subscribed to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The two are not unrelated in the sense that both had a very heavily invested local readership. So the AJC kind of abandoned its local readership several decades ago. They're now online only. They also this week announced further cuts, 50 employees. That's about 15% of their overall staff. But with the Post, I subscribe to it regardless of the political bias. I also subscribe to the Times and the Journal, the same. But I wanted the local news. I wanted the metro section reporting. I wanted the sports. I wanted the local information that I couldn't get in national papers. And the Post very slowly chipped away at that audience too, or I would say took it for granted. And the cuts today are getting rid entirely. The conceit is done. This is not anything for local people who live in this area. I have not gone to the Washington Post for anything other than weather news, like a basic weather report in ages, because the metro section was hollowed out. They did not cover local crime when we had a huge crime spike in the district. Over and over again throughout the years, I ended up not finding anything useful to my life as a local resident in this area. And so I dropped my subscription. It didn't make sense. I could get the polemics elsewhere. I could get much better foreign reporting and national news reporting from the Time to the Journal. And so it had no use. And I think the abandonment of local reporting matters here too, because people crave it, but there's no one servicing it. And that's what papers like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Post, when it was doing its job, used to offer.
And the New York Post, since John mentioned the New York Post in the beginning, that is thriving, at least as of now, and just opened a new paper, right, Christine? I mean, the New York Post covers the hell out of New York.
Yeah, they go to those committee meetings, and I would love the New York Post to open a branch here in DC. Right. Nobody's covering that stuff here.
Two things here. One, Eliana's narrative about the sort of sugar high of the Washington Post's numbers was belied before Bezos decided to announce that he didn't want to run a woke paper anymore. By its losses, it had all of these subscribers, it had this, it had that. It lost $100 million in 2023. Lost $100 million. At the same time, the New York Times was minting money. So what happened that the Post failed and the New York Times succeeded? And there are many causes for this.
In part, it's a failure to build out cooking and games and all the non-news things that make you money. And in part, the Biden era, the Post did not do as well in the Biden era because its subscribers, the people who went to it for the anti-Trump news that was a boon for it between 2016 and 2020, people were not as interested in the Biden era news, which, shall we say, the Post was not leaning into as hard to cover the Biden administration with the aggressiveness with which it had covered the Trump administration. The era was not as exciting for them. And then the exclamation point was the decision in 2024 not to endorse anybody.
Right.
But really, news is not that profitable. It is these other gizmos that are tacked onto it that the Time has had extraordinary success with that have made it profitable.
Okay, so this is the thing. Newspapers like football teams or whatever are very editor driven. They're leadership driven. The fish rots from the head, or the fish is tasty because it doesn't rot from the head. In the early years of the Bezos paper, it had a good editor. I mean, I have many political problems with Marty Baron, who had been the editor of the Boston Globe and then became the editor of the Washington Post. But Marty Baron knew how to run a newspaper. And he understood that a newspaper is a lot of interlocking pieces. And some of them have to do with fun. And when you talk about cooking and games and stuff like that, the New York Times, which people do and then say, oh, you see, it's really because of cooking and games. Newspapers have always been sold, not because people want to read the editorial page and because they want to read the foreign news. Most people bought the newspaper when the newspaper was the way you got your news because they wanted the supermarket ads on Wednesday, and they wanted the weekend movie listings on Friday, and they wanted Walter Scott's personality parade in the Parade magazine insert. In every city in America had a newspaper that had the Parade magazine insert.
And the classified ads, which funded so much of the classified ads, which Craigslist decimated.
The classified ads, right, which people liked to read. So what does this tell you? It tells you that newspapers were compendia, and they provided a lot of stuff for a lot of different people. If you wanted sports, there was sports. If you wanted business news, there was. If you wanted local news, there was local news. If you wanted weather, if you wanted comic strips. And the Post, unlike the New York Times was a less fun paper. The New York Times suddenly became kind of a fun paper. A lot of recipes, Wirecutter giving you advice on what luggage to buy, and the games. And the Post, which had been kind of a fun paper, had a very jazzy style section, had the best sports writers in America, or what people thought were, I mean, I didn't really like them, but Sally Jenkins and Tom Boswell and Tony Kornheiser and a whole bunch of people. It was fun. It was alive. When Ben Bradley was the editor, it was alive. When Marty Baron was the editor, it was alive. And what the Post has been since 2021, or at least since, has been dead. It is dead, and it is not fun, and it is not lively, and it doesn't draw you in. And one of the reasons that they stopped doing things like covering local news, as Christine mentioned, why was that? Because it's politically inconvenient for them and ideologically inconvenient for them to talk about a high crime city in which 80% of the crime is committed by African Americans, which they do not want to highlight. They don't want to talk about. They get worried about in staff revolts in which they're going to be accused of giving a bad name to racial minorities. So that goes by the wayside, and they
reported it, but they wouldn't report the race of the perpetrator. That was their compromise. They would report the crime for a while, but without the race of the perpetrator.
But to cover crime, if you're the New York Post and you're the New York Post of the last 2 years, here's how you're covering crime. You're saying this guy pushed this guy onto a railroad, onto a subway track. There's a maniac who just stabbed somebody in Times Square.
And he had 38 prior convictions and was just let out on bail last week.
All these things that contribute to a narrative about crime and liberal governance that liberals do not want to hear, but that maybe if you really cover it, it becomes addictive because people live in the district and people live in Virginia and they live in Maryland and they would like to know what is going on where they live. And the New York Times, by the way, has also denuded itself to some degree of its metro coverage, but its scope nationally and internationally and its success with these digital subscriptions nationally and internationally has covered a lot of that up. And they ceded a lot of metro stuff to the New York Post, which has, as you will, if there's a market hole and the Post fills it, then there's the Post with what you can get from it that you cannot get from somewhere else. And you can get liberalism from 10 other places, and you can get wokeism from 10 other places, and advice columns from 10 other places. But you couldn't get Wordle anywhere but in the New York Times, and you couldn't get Wirecutter anywhere but in the New York Times, and you couldn't get Spelling Bee anywhere but in the New York Times. And there's nothing in the Washington Post that you can't get somewhere else. And you know what? Better, not worse, better. Like, they used to be an obnoxious leftist newspaper that drove me crazy, but you couldn't deny that it had really good writers, it had really good reporters, they did really good enterprise work, they did massive, exposés on things and stuff like that. And then it just started to wither after the death of Kay Graham and the sort of the loss of purpose or vision for what the paper should be.
I just want to say, if at times shows also that if you have the Wordle and Wirecutter and the recipes, whatever, you can then be as woke as you want. I know you guys are saying that the Washington Post is the most woke. Don't forget, the New York Times foisted the 1619 Project on all of us. That's a pretty major woke initiative. But they could fund it with all this other with the fun stuff that John's talking about.
Well, can I make one other existential?
Their woke stuff. There's a huge audience for that. My point was, they defined themselves as that, cultivated a huge audience for it, and then said, never mind, we're not that. And that's a problem because they're losing that audience, and it's difficult to lose that and try to cultivate a new one. Like, that's the pickle they're in now, which, as I said before, like, that's a generational challenge to try to shed the old audience, cultivate a new audience, decide your brand is not democracy dies in darkness, but we're keeping the slogan. But, our editorial page is going to be free markets and free people. And actually we love America. It's a bit of a mess.
There's also to the earlier point about how a lot of people came to these papers when they were still print publications and like the fun stuff. There's also a broader kind of tragic process here that isn't just the internet's fault. And that's that the culture of reading, the culture of sitting down and reading a newspaper every day and sort of keeping oneself well informed, the gateway drug for a child was often the comic page, because you could sit there and read the comics while you watched your dad and mom read the paper. And then maybe you read the sports page as you got older, and maybe occasionally you'd sort of look through the paper. There was a culture of reading news that obviously the internet and social media has completely shattered. But one of the identity crises these papers are in is that they're trying to chase that new regime. Remember the pivot to video, where everybody pivoted to video to satisfy Facebook algorithms and decimated? That was the first wave of huge cuts for a lot of publications. That was a failure. They're chasing something rather than saying, our public service role isn't just being woke or being anti-woke, or it's servicing the people who read your paper. And some of those are local and some of those are sports enthusiasts. But I think that the vision of journalism at this national level has narrowed so much to an ideological mission for so many of these editors and reporters that they can't even see what they're not doing that is actually part of service journalism. That's going to those city council meetings like Seth had to do as a young reporter, and being bored out of your mind, but learning how government works and noticing corruption. A lot of the graft that we talk about now in places like Minneapolis and across the country happens because no one's covering those small, local level meetings. There is a market for that if someone entrepreneurial and thoughtful would seek it out. Axios has tried to do some local stuff, but they're okay. But I think there's still a need for that.
There's a need, but by the way, the reason that I said that the Post was the most woke paper and not the New York Times is that in the absence of doing not only games and stuff like that, but in the absence of like committing serious resources to very like sophisticated reporting projects in which they really did make innovative use of video, data, visualizations, things like that. And the Post didn't go there, or was not competent enough to get there, or figure out how to use its resources to get there. And so what it had was woke with nothing else. It had Karen Attiah and 17 advice columns. Post literally has like 8 advice columns. And it has an advice column for Black people. And it has an advice column for gay people. And it has a regular advice guide. It has a dating advice column. And that is sugar. Now, I'm all in favor of advice columns. And I will tell you a quick advice column story from my own time as an editor at the Washington Times, when we took, and we had a bunch of advice columns, and we had to kill one for various reasons. A new one that had started, a guy named Jeffrey Zaslow had started a new advice column, and we killed it. And the day that we killed it, and nobody read the Washington Times, like it had a very small, 75, 80,000 people were reading it a day. And we got like 1,000 phone calls, because that's actually what people read. Like they actually read Jeffrey Zaslow's advice column. And so I learned, like, okay, you know what? Like, I thought nobody cares about this, and they still have Dear Abby and Ann Landers. We had 2 others. Didn't matter. Like, you fiddle around with stuff that you find unimportant, but that other people find important at your peril. Most read thing in a lot of papers for a long time was the horoscopes. An argument to be made that newspapers shouldn't publish horoscopes, right? They're fake. They're lies. It's nonsense. It's garbage. And, we shouldn't be like doing junk science or, ludicrous magic. But you know what?
My horoscope yesterday said that people would cast out on predictions and horoscopes.
Okay. I'm just saying, but you know what? Even I, a moron, in my 20s when I would do that, wouldn't have killed the horoscope column, because that really would have brought down the wrath of Zeus on your head.
You're just saying that because Mercury's in retrograde, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anyway, it's a very complicated thing to run these institutions. And as I say, Barron sort of knew how to run it. And then when he left and they hired this woman from AP, Sally Busby, and she didn't know what she was doing. And I don't even know who the editor is now. Not that it matters. I think generally speaking, there's that. And then of course they're all it's a guild. the world of the mainstream media is a guild. So like, all I'm reading is all this sentimental hogwash on Twitter about how wonderful the Washington Post staff is and how monstrous this stuff is that is happening to them. And I will tell you that, like, from being somebody in the mainstream media, as I was for a long time, but with unconventional, political views in that world, or publishing at conservative institutions that were trying to be mainstream, like the Washington Times or the New York Post, the viciousness that was hurled at us by the mainstream media, and the celebration that they would have if the bad news came out about the circulation numbers of the Washington Times or the New York Post, was comic, because they just didn't like us because they didn't like our politics. But they're the ones who are supposed to be in competition with each other. Like, the New York Times is White House correspondent should not be best friends with the Washington Post's White House correspondent. They should hate each other the way boxers hate each other. They're in competition with each other. Only one can be the top dog. But
this
is
something that's bothered me from the beginning of this debate, because it's like, I remember being at the New York Post, and I remember watching when Trump came into office, and then he'd call on a reporter from the New York Post, and Politico would snark about it. And it's like, oh, Politico is snarking about a reporter from America's longest, oldest, continuously published newspaper, the one with Alexander Hamilton on the masthead, getting a question at a presidential news conference. Alexander Hamilton would not know what Politico is. It's like this. There is a way that they have, when somebody like Jim Acosta gets yelled at by Trump and kicked out of the press pool or the Oval Office or whatever, everybody goes nuts about press freedom. And fine, I would have rather seen Jim Acosta stay also, because it was very highly entertaining. But then anything like that, and the New York Post gets a question at a news conference, and everybody is just full of total snark, if this newspaper isn't running rings around your newspaper, and that's why this is really good point.
How about Peter Doocy? How about Peter Doocy during the Biden era? Peter Doocy, Fox News, is the Fox News correspondent in the press room, and what does he do? He says, "What happened with this? Why did you let the CDC shut down rent? What about your cognitive test? People are saying, Mr. President, that you've lost a step or two cognitively." And then people were like, "Peter Doocy, he's terrible. Someone should kick him out of the press room."
Not only that, we've heard stories. I've heard stories personally in the background about the handful of mainstream reporters who ask those questions and how they're treated by their colleagues and how they're treated by the White House. And nobody talked about that out loud, because these aren't people who should be reporters. They're people who wanted to pursue, and there are a lot of these people, and a lot of them work at the Washington Post. There are a huge class of people who are motivated by politics, who actually should be working in democratic politics, and who feel that journalism is a virtuous way to pursue political goals.
Right.
And they believe that the best way to advance democratic political goals is at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at CNN. And we see it every single day. Okay. Jim Acosta was the White House correspondent for CNN. And now we hear, on his Substack, what he really thinks. Don Lemon was the morning news host at CNN. And now we can go, see him bust up a church and hear what he really thinks. But on the contrary, I covered the Trump White House at Politico, and then announced that I'm taking a job to go at the Free Beacon. And CNN calls to tell me the day that it's announced, your contract will not be renewed at CNN, which nobody's entitled to that, but it gives you some insight into their thinking. And then you're just disappeared from being in the in crowd of reporters, because you indicate you don't share their ideological preferences. They're one big ideological in crowd. The idea that they compete, sure, they compete for scoops and stuff, but they're all rowing ideologically in the same direction. They believe the same things. They don't call each other out on errors in their reporting, because they socialize together, they travel together, they party together, and they party with the, Democrats in Congress, Democrats in the White House. They're all one big crowd. And we see a lot of it. The Epstein emails is part of this. It shows this too. I'm not for their release, but you see it when you are a White House correspondent. You see how they're one team.
Look, to Eliana's point and to Seth's point about the New York Post, don't forget, the Post was the only source, the only outlet that had this massive scoop on Hunter Biden's laptop. And every other major outlet tried to discredit it.
I mean,
yeah, there were. I wish I had brought them up before. That's such a great point because of here's why we're not writing about the laptop notes that were
Absolutely.
Here's NPR had one, right? An explanation, here's why you won't see the laptop coverage on NPR or whatever.
Yeah, and they write, we couldn't verify it, but none of them are scrambling to verify the scoop because they don't want to. They don't, the way that they feel it in their kishkas to go pursue Trump and catch this administration in every act. They simply don't feel that with the Democratic White House, a Democratic administration, Hunter Biden's laptop, the way that we're seeing some fantastic reporting on the Trump kids and their business and the Witkoff kids. There was just an amazing Wall Street Journal story about this. We did not see, except for Ken Vogel at the New York Times, who is, ostracized by some of his colleagues for this, except for, you could count the people on one hand.
Now,
because they don't feel it in their kishkas.
And also, just as a side point, where was the uprising over the threats to free media when the Hunter Biden story came out, and everyone colluded in squashing the Post, and you couldn't share the story on social media, and Facebook was in on. Where were the concerns about Facebook meddling in politics when Facebook was squashing the New York Post story during an election?
But of course, Facebook was correcting for its grievous, monstrous error in 2016 because it got Trump elected because it allowed information about Cambridge Analytica to be shared. Remember Mark Zuckerberg going to Capitol Hill in 2017 and apologizing for the Russian meddling on Facebook, the Russian meddling story, which became the convenient liberal explanation for why it was that the queen of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, was ritually humiliated in a defeat at the hands of Donald Trump. It couldn't be that she was an unattractive candidate and that her political message had passed its sell date, and that Trump was saying something new that people wanted to hear. It was that the Russians were in collusion with the Facebook to, destroy American democracy. And so when 2020 came around, all of the social media companies had their marching orders from what had happened for the previous 4 years. It's like, if you don't do what we say and suppress this story about the laptop, you're just going to be getting Trump elected again. And it's worse than that. Held responsible.
It's worse than that, because what we know about the trust and safety team at Twitter before Elon Musk bought Twitter was that they were actively colluding with members of the Biden administration to suppress all kinds of things, COVID-related issues. And we know that they actively, that's a huge First Amendment violation. That is literally the federal government censoring private citizens for speech. And it happened quite a bit during the Biden administration. And there was an entire infrastructure, both at the White House and embedded in these social media organizations, not just Twitter, but also Facebook and Google and YouTube. All of them had people who shared the kind of ideological mission that Eliana described among mainstream journalists, extremely left-wing, very much covering up what they were doing in terms of, fighting misinformation and disinformation. But what they were doing was advancing an ideological project that the Biden administration brought a lot of pressure to bear on these tech
The
companies.
Washington
And I think
Post,
it's why
yeah.
we see the reaction we do now to, there's so much right-wing garbage on X now since Elon Musk kind of opened the floodgates. But I think that's a response to the fact that everybody knew that this kind of pressure was happening and that it was really only politically moving in one direction.
And by the way, this traveling as a pack, thinking the same way, hanging out together, this all explains the reaction to Barry Weiss too, and the New Yorker profile and the New York Times pieces, because she's not one of them. They don't agree with her ideologically. There's nobody saying, oh, like maybe a shakeup is needed. CBS wasn't doing so great. It's all just a defense of the ideological priors and of the status quo and the in crowd and the people they know and the people they've hung out with and the current 60 Minutes staff.
The Washington Post has a union, right? So as a union, what does the union do? It negotiates over trying to get more money or whatever. Okay. Imagine a world in which the union or the people in the union or the newsroom or something like that had buy-in on the idea that the success or failure of the institution financially had something to do with what they were producing to sell the institution. And in 2021, 2022, when the numbers started to go bad for the Washington Post, when losses started to accrete to the Washington Post, did people in the newsroom go to Jeff Bezos or whoever was Fred Ryan, I guess, who was the publisher then or something, and say, look, we know things are going south. What can we all do together to save this fabled, glorious institution? What can we work together to figure out how to get us on a track where we are going to produce something that people want to read and that we will be successful at? No, anyone ever says, boo, the Washington Post isn't very good, including people at the paper. And they all get hoity-toity and high and mighty and say, we're great. We are wonderful. And you know who else says we're wonderful? That guy over there at the Atlantic who used to work with us and is now being subsidized by Lorene Jobs. He says I'm wonderful too. And you know who else says I'm wonderful? The Columbia Journalism Review, which, as Seth would point, is crying bitter tears over the folding of Teen Vogue because there's no longer an idiot publication website to praise trans terrorism or whatever. Like, they don't take any responsibility for the success, for the failure of the institution. They just want all the glory of having the byline and for the institution's reputation to remain what it was 30 or 40 years ago. But looking hard at yourself and saying, we're not doing well, and the New York Times is doing great, and we're doing lousy. What are we doing wrong? That is something that reporters and editors, in my experience, 40 plus years in this business, never do. They're proud. They're full of self-pity. They're arrogant. They're angry. They always feel like they're being oppressed by their editors and by the business side and all of that. And the idea that they are producing the work that either sells or doesn't sell never comes into their heads. And if you go on Twitter today and read the encomia to this third-rate staff that produced this junk-ass paper, it's comic. Name me a single story that the Washington Post has produced in the last 2 years where you go, wow, the Post really killed that one. It went to town on that thing. It didn't even do that well on Doge. Doge was like that was like a softball. Like that was like a lob right across the plate. And like, did they own the Doge story? Did they own no, because they're not good, because they don't know, because they lost the ability to do a good job with what it is that they do. And by the way, I should mention, talking all this New York Post stuff, just in case anybody wants to say, I no longer work at the Post. I was a freelance writer for the New York Post for about 16, 17 years after I was on staff, from basically 1993 to 2008. And so I am not here to represent the New York Post. I don't rep the New York Post. I don't write for it anymore. That's why I feel completely comfortable in praising its astonishing success, which sadly, it doesn't exactly, parallel the moment that I stopped writing as regularly for. But you could blame me. You could say my departure from the Post actually accelerated its success. So anyway, that's why I'm comfortable doing that. And also, I loathe the New York Times, but like, fair is fair. They said something very interesting today when they released the information about their subscriber base now being over 13 million, which is, having figured out how to integrate video and data and this and that, they're going to watch over the next couple of years to see the ways in which people consume news and whether people will come to the New York Times as a portal for news video, in a video context. Could you see the New York Post becoming the equivalent of ABC World News Tonight? Sure. Could the New York Times, produce a nightly newscast? Sure. It produced The Daily. It was the first newspaper to have a major daily podcast 10 years ago. It innovated in that area using its own staff and its own resources as the podcast world was blowing up. Daily is, I think, still in the top 5 of podcasts in America. Could they transition into becoming not only the sort of newspaper, but the TV news network? Sure. And they would do it not because they set out to do it, but because it's an organic growth of its own success. And because they did what they knew how to do, and then they started introducing changes, small changes, little bits of changes, seeing how they went, investing more resources once they saw that this worked and that didn't work, and all of that. And that's how things are successful. It's
right.
Not
There's this
guys in darkness, and then the gods anoint you the voice of America.
Right. But also, although, it was true with some personalities, and it was true with Page Six to some extent, the New York Post was the brand, and even Page Six was the brand. It was very rare. It happened. It absolutely happened. But it was rare that the writer was the brand at the New York Post, and certainly not really in the modern era when you had this problem of the New York Times and Washington Post swapping brands, human brands. And, the way that they would go after their employers on Twitter and stuff like, we've talked about that at length. The Washington Post had a particular problem with that because they enabled this sort of new era of the person is the brand. But the New York Post just said, what do we do well? And so you see things like Decider.com. What's Decider.com? It's an entertainment site. And, I find myself checking it all the time because every day tells me what's new on streaming, like that day.
Yeah.
It's like literally and sometimes there are good articles, whatever, but I just mean there's a usefulness that I find, right? New York Post realized that, with all the streaming and everything that gets added to it, it's pretty hard to keep track of what is where and when. For example, I need a guide to watch sports now in the new streaming world, because I used to be able to just turn on the TV and go to channel 4 or 5 or 7 and watch sports, or ESPN. And now you have to figure out what the sister streaming station is to these, if it's on NBC, it's Peacock, whatever. The designer figured out that people, help them sort it out day by day. I don't know how many views they get daily, but I bet it's a lot. And I bet it's because they found a useful thing that people need to return to daily. And they found it because the New York Post has always been good with entertainment and gossip and
one
that
thing I
world.
was going to add, the one thing that has deteriorated in the New York Post, and this is a direct result of social media, is page 6. They're not breaking tons of stories anymore because those are broken now on social media. And to Seth's making a very important point about how journalism has changed and how that has impacted these institutions. And it's like the Starchitect problem, when you started to have a handful of star architects that had to do every big project and everyone sought them out and everyone had to mimic their style. And, so like the cut rate Starchitect would get hired when the real Starchitect you couldn't afford them. But there's a version of that in journalism where they become a brand. They appear on television and they have, they're affiliated with a particular institution. And the Washington Post had a ton of these. But they start to see themselves as being above and beyond the institution. And Karen Attiah is the perfect example. And when she was finally cut loose, years past the point where she should have been fired, she really couldn't believe it. And she did this very performative outrage thing that was kind of amusing, although we should never laugh when someone loses a job. That's always a tough thing, no matter how terrible they were at their job. But that, I think, is the future, where there's a lot of platforming of individual journalistic brands. And what the Times, I think, did well was be very disciplined with its own staff who started to become a brand. They would pull them in and say, actually, you have to do this in-house. You have, or you have to leave. And I think that was the kind of discipline that the Washington Post seemed to lack in terms of its strategic planning, as you said, John, that the Times seemed to be good at doing.
By the way, just off topic, but just because you raised Frank Gehry, I want to David Fromm's famous great remark that when you hire Frank Gehry to design a monument, you get a monument to Frank Gehry.
Fair enough. Well, speaking of people who don't have monuments built to them, and somebody else that, as we're having this conversation, his name has been floating in the background, is Rupert Murdoch. And why do I bring up Rupert Murdoch? I bring him up because he's 95 years old. There's Gabriel Sherman is about to publish his 17th hit job on Rupert Murdoch. There's some book about the
this one's going to stick.
This one's going to stay. But the decline of the Murdoch family, or the fights in the Murdoch family that we read about, and the tragic, classic, heirs fighting over their inheritance before the founder is gone, and all of this stuff. But here's the thing about Rupert Murdoch. This is a guy, everybody hates him. They think he's terrible, which he isn't. I've known him for, he was my boss for a long time, and I've known him for many years. But the thing about him is he loves the business of transmitting and creating and producing and broadcasting news and the world and the institutions that do this. And what does he do at the age of 95? He starts a new newspaper. He has started, the newspapers are folding. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is folding. Newspapers are folding. Newspapers are shells of their former self. Rupert is starting a new paper. In 2010, when the iPad came along and seemed to be this new thing that might be an entirely new way to transmit news, he started a daily iPad newspaper that it became very clear after 6 months was a dead letter. And so they killed it. But he did it, and he invested massive resources in it. I think they lost $40 million in 6 months or something like that. But the point is, if there was a new medium, he was going to jump into it and see if it was going to work. Just as when all the rules in cable television changed, he jumped in with the Fox News channel. And of course, it is the most successful journalistic creation of my lifetime. Started in 1996, I think. So it's 30 years old. And it is, in my adult lifetime, nothing like it was ever came into being. Out of nowhere, dominating the news business, dominating the cable news business, 5 times to 7 times the audience of its rivals, because it fills a hole that still nobody in the world seems to want to fill. And the point is that he does this because he is an exceptionally creative, visionary, and risk-taking entrepreneur in the world of media and news media. And you hate him, go ahead and hate him. You hate him because you ain't him. Like, if you had one, if you had one on the liberal side, you would be singing his hosannas. And you don't, so you don't. But if you think that what's important is having a bumptious, fractious world of conversation and debate and news gathering and all of that, you want a Rupert, and you should be looking around and saying, why don't I have one on my team, on my side? Or you could say, basically, the Sulzberger family has, after much struggle, has turned the New York Times into that. But it is only one thing, and Rupert's got stuff in England, here, there, and you think he's terrible, go right ahead. If for the world and the world's ability to have the expression of a lot of different kinds of opinions, including ones that I find noxious or embarrassing, as I find much of Fox News Channel noxious and embarrassing, nonetheless, that is a net contribution to the world storehouse of knowledge and freedom. And and everybody who wants to shut him down or say he's been a force for evil are themselves people who have done absolutely nothing to advance the interests of people thinking for themselves.
Well, this
but
is
rather
why
are believers in groupthink.
This is why what we often say about the need, we'd actually like to have a functioning oppositional Democratic Party that makes arguments that can be fought against. It makes your own position stronger. Like if I'm a conservative, I want a really smart liberal on the other side of the same issue who I can argue with, because it helps me understand the weaknesses in my own case that I'm trying to make. The same is true in the media environment. I think it's why you saw certainly the free press is I think the best example of this in print and digital journalism, but in broadcast journalism too, you see people really craving some alternative, and it's because it offers this alternative view. And so for whatever flaws Fox News have, it's competitive and it gets eyeballs on, and that forces other people, which I think is what Barry Weiss is trying to do at CBS News now. It forces those older institutions to change or to fail. And I think with the Post right now, that's what they really struggled with. They had some token conservatives who wrote for them, but in all the other areas, in I think the book section has also gotten killed today, like in a lot of their arts criticism and a lot of their cultural reporting, they really didn't bring in alternative views very often. And that's something that, again, a suburban DMV audience, there are plenty of government workers, but not all of them are Democratic voters. Not all of them are liberals. Some of them are old school Republicans, old school conservatives. They were not serving that need, and people just stopped reading. I mean, they're not going to fight about it. They're just going to cancel their subscription.
By the way, to Christine's starting point there about how we want a smart, literate left to sharpen our own positions and arguments. The opposite happened, so the right became dumber in response.
I think that is a very strong. There's a very strong case for that.
John, you're muted.
I think we should talk for a couple of minutes about what happened yesterday off the shores of Iran. Just to make note of the fact that the Iranians essentially are looking to, rather than draw down or negotiate with us, they're like looking to start a war with us. A drone fired at the USS Abraham Lincoln that was shot down by a U.S. jet, and then an effort to board a U.S. ship that basically ignored whoever it was that came up beside them and said, stand down, we're going to board you. They just steamed through, apparently. But as we've been discussing Iran, it doesn't look to me like the Iranians are looking to make peace. I don't know what they're thinking. Firing a drone at the USS Abraham Lincoln seems like not the wisest strategy, but it did happen.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's one of two things. Either they actually think that they are ready to take on the U.S. and or Israel, or they're trying to ward off an attack by frightening us.
Yeah, I mean, you fire at the Americans while Trump is president. I don't know what they expect. I mean, I read the Wall Street Journal has a piece where it says the headline is Iran plays hardball with the U.S. to throw it off balance, and the idea is that they were trying to do just that, play hardball with negotiation. But I laughed. Not because the Journal is accurately reporting what Iran thinks it's doing. I laughed at the idea that the Iranians think that a drone at the USS Abraham or gunships harassing a U.S. flagged oil tanker is the way to throw Trump a brushback pitch. Well, he's not going to mess with us now. I mean, it's almost like intentionally poking the bear. I can't understand what they thought they were doing, but the fact that I laughed, I didn't used to laugh when the Iranians would try to, corral 12 British sailors and throw them, into a prison to negotiate their release or something like that. They used to cause menace that was dangerous and never funny. And there is something about the atmosphere of international relations now that the idea of the Iranians standing up, sticking their chin out, jutting their chin out at Trump on the eve of these negotiations is hilarious to me because they've been flattened and because they are so obviously not a threat. And I think it's interesting. And I wonder if while they were trying to do something conventional, which is play hardball, that is a conventional thing to do in diplomacy, I wonder if the reaction that I had is very common around the region and that it may backfire, not because people dismiss it, but because people literally laugh them out of the room.
I would suggest one other possibility, which is that we are on different timelines thinking about the conflict between the United States and Iran. Americans think that our conflict with Iran really began with Operation Midnight Hammer. That we hit Iran, and boy, and now they're like, they're bleeding, or that we were helping the Israelis do things, but we were very much in the background. The Iranians may look at this and say, really, since the U.S. went into Iraq in 2003, we have been sticking it to them over and over and over again. We killed 1,000 Americans. We are responsible for the deaths of around 1,000 of the 4,000 Americans who died in Iraq, by prudential calculations, and injuries. We fomented and paid for the rebellion that sank Iraq into civil war, and since then we just do nothing but make trouble for them. We have in their heads, they could think we have an unbroken series of successes in making America's life hard and tortuous in the Middle East, and they never do anything. Yeah, they killed Soleimani. That's it. Like, they never do anything. We shoot at them, and they, 2008, they never shot back. Like, Bush didn't shoot back, and they're paper tigers. And maybe there are people in the Iranian leadership who are thinking of this like 25-year period since, 9/11 basically, and thinking that we're, when push comes to shove, if they take pot shots at us, we don't respond. Because, as I say, they look at it through the lens of their action and they see that we are inactive in response to them, not that we are active. And I think that that's probably a terrible miscalculation. That the more they poke, the likelier it is that there will be a response. Okay, I have a quick recommendation, then we can go. I just finished watching a very charming, very slight Netflix Agatha Christie adaptation called Seven Dials, which I think premiered a couple of weeks ago, featuring I mean, in sort of supporting roles. The lead actors are people you've never heard of, British actors you've never heard of, but the Martin Freeman and Helena Bonham Carter are sort of two of the eccentric Agatha Christie-like characters who populate this story about a very aristocratic family that finds itself enmeshed in a kind of political conspiracy with a masked shadowy group that seems to have interfered with the family's life since the end of World War I, and it takes place in like 1925 in London, and it's fun and charming. The person who wrote Broadchurch, which had
fantastic show.
Well, the first season was fantastic. The second season was one of the worst things I ever saw. But the first season of Broadchurch was amazing. His name was Chris Chibnall. Anyway, it's very charming. It's 3 hours long, so it's not much of a haul, and it is very lavish. And you get to wander around beautifully recreated 1925 London and these manor houses and things like that. So just for interior decorating alone, it's worth the time. So that's Seven Dials on Netflix, and we'll be back tomorrow. So for Christine, Seth, Eliana, and Abe, I'm John Pump Keep the candle burning.